Everything that follows is true. Italy is true. The castle is true. The girls are all true. And the boys are all true. Rita is true. Adriano, incredibly, is true. Not even the names have been changed. Why bother? To protect the innocent? There were no innocent. Or else all of them were innocent but cannot be protected.
I'm sat here with Leon Craig, a debut novelist whose first work, The Decadence, is, I think, available in paperback in August?
Yes, it is coming in August. Thank
Excellent.
you, Jack.
Your debut work, of course, being the short story collection Parallel Hells, which was published in early 2022. I mention all of this because you are a fairly new writer on the scene, Leon, and I think it's worth us introducing you to the listeners of My Martin Amis as, some might argue, an unlikely fan, only because it's never guaranteed that a young person will speak openly and proudly about how much Martin Amis has influenced them. But the more who step forward to say so, the happier I am, frankly. So thank you very much for joining me, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're about to have.
I'm very much looking forward to it as well. Thank you so much, Jack. And yes, perhaps there is, in fact, a secret underground of millennials and indeed millennial women who love Martin Amis and want to talk about him. So may I be the first of many.
The novel that you've chosen to speak about is a first on the series. I have wondered, as I said to you earlier, why The Pregnant Widow, published in 2010, hadn't been brought up before. Anyone who knows your work will know that the themes of your first novel, The Decadence, overlap quite strongly with The Pregnant Widow. Was this just a coincidence? I doubt it was.
No, it's certainly not just an eerie coincidence. I think Martin implanted himself into my mind in ways I hadn't even realised until I began preparing for the podcast. So my novel, The Decadence, is about 6 very disagreeable, argumentative people who go on an illegal pandemic holiday and are so busy cheating on each other and taking drugs that they don't realise that the house they're staying in is very haunted until it's almost too late. So ghosts aside, I mean, the first thing that springs out to me is the Decameron element, because The Decadence is very much riffing on that escape from the city to get away from a plague and go somewhere remote. Obviously, in the original Decameron, they're behaving ever so well and the stories themselves are very smutty. In my novel, the millennial characters are not as inhibited. And in The Pregnant Widow, the sexual revolution is just happening. I mean, you know, the tension is in the air. Scheherazade's breasts are out. You know, one of our many Keiths is, you know, trying really hard to cheat or possibly not cheat, depending on the hour, minute, second, on his university girlfriend, Lily. And you have the sense that he's perhaps not quite ready for what's about to hit him sexually, politically, literarily.
What about reading The Pregnant Widow had an influence on your first novel?
It's funny, actually, because my first encounter with it was pre-pandemic, and some of the themes did not resonate with me, at least consciously, as much as they now do. I mean, for instance, the passage in which the narrator realizes that he has a past, and it's sort of one of his almost few consolations for growing older. I mean, I'm not in my 50s, but I think that the pandemic had a really strange effect on perceived time, and also because in the middle of the pandemic, I moved from London to Berlin, and that again provides this very firm sort of severing sensation. On the other side of all of that severing, there is the past, and it is now inaccessible. So you want to dive back into it and swim about in it. And that sensation now of discovering you have a past and kind of endlessly, gloomily pondering it felt much more relatable than it did in, let's say, 2019, when I first, I think, started engaging with The Pregnant Widow. And further to that, although a lot of what Keith is actually doing is trying to speed read the English canon, all of the debates and politicization of kind of everyday life is very much lurking in the background, and Amis as narrator is kind of gesturing towards it. I think there's something about the shadow falling across the Harlequinade, and that shadow being shaped quite a lot like Charles Manson. And I think my relation to that, both personally and as a writer, is that shadow has very much already fallen. So trying to both have lifelike characters who are very invested in the politics of their day, but also exist as hopefully rounded humans beyond that, was something that really preoccupied me. And looking again at how Amos did it was, I think, very valuable in terms of learning how to write those debates, but not only write them.
Writing those debates, yeah. I mean, there often is in Amos's novels a subliminal discourse. And with respect to the sexual revolution, this is the story of a sexual trauma, Amos writes at the beginning of this novel. Obviously, both of us are generationally removed, though very much living in the shadow of the sexual revolution. We're still dealing with its consequences today. But this is very much what Amos is attempting to do with The Pregnant Widow, isn't he? He's sort of revising the fallout of the sexual revolution. In fact, one of the characters, Violet Nearing, is based on one of his own relatives, Sally Amos, who he called a spectacular casualty of that revolution.
Yes, I mean, the framing of that has become more and more interesting to me, because I'm not sure how Sally Amos, for instance, would have fared in the 1950s. Perhaps she would have ended up being subject to some kind of institutionalization, which would also have been very tragic and difficult for her. I mean, the first time I engaged with The Pregnant Widow, the sexual revolution seemed very much like a done deal, and I was curious about why it felt necessary to kind of engage with it with the critical eye. And then as I read on, the passage where I think Keith is talking about sex as just play and sensation and something that's kind of detached from emotion. At that point, it suddenly became relevant and interesting to me again, because actually, I don't think that particular facet of the debate has ever gone away. And I think it's a debate that we have with ourselves, with other people, with society at large. I mean, how much are we expected to mean everything that we do sexually, or for it to be to a kind of socially recognized end? And Keith really doesn't know. I mean, to one extent, he's just trying to get his end away, but to another extent, he's also comparing himself to Clarissa and the villain. So I think that my relation to that is that I grew up very interested in the English canon. I went on to study English, but, I'm also a woman and I'm a lesbian. So I'm looking at men looking at women. It's very culturally familiar, but it is a personally unfamiliar lens. So it's refracted in a different way for me. And then in the writing of my own novel, trying to relate the protagonist Jan's problems, where she's madly in love with two women at the same time, both of whom don't really want her, and both of whom have very tortured relationships with their own sexuality. So that kind of feeling versus romance debate surfaces again, but because it's sort of wearing this patina of queerness, it seems like it's unfamiliar, and it's actually kind of a similar problem to Keith's.
But what you say there about Keith's view of sex as being kind of made up of surface sensation, and the whole point of it being for pleasure, again, all in the ethos of the sexual revolution. There's one quote that jumps out at me from the book. Surface will start tending to supersede essence. As the self becomes postmodern, how things look will become at least as important as how things are. Essences are hearts, surfaces are sensations. He's describing in a kind of a very discursive way throughout the novel, the way in which culture becomes far more interested in pleasure. It becomes far more quick to jump on opportunities to achieve a personal gratification, often at the expense of others, often using others as a tool for your own pleasure. And so much more. I mean, just the emphasis on beauty. He speaks at the beginning of the novel about body dysmorphia. Again, I think something which, when Keith internalizes his own body dysmorphia, seems more relevant than ever, given the way that body dysmorphia affects more and more young men. Give us the plot of The Pregnant Widow, for those who don't know it.
Happily so. Keith Nearing is 20, about to be 21. The year is 1970. He is invited to the Italian castle of Scheherazade, who is a close friend of his girlfriend Lily, with whom he has an on-off relationship. And Scheherazade's boyfriend is away in the Middle East hunting and getting into various scrapes. So Scheherazade is left unattended. I think her parents are at the castle, but they're not especially, her mother is definitely, but they're not especially interested or involved. So the kind of core triangle is Keith, Lily, Scheherazade. And then because Scheherazade and Lily are sunbathing topless, Keith becomes more and more fixated on Scheherazade in a way that's very uncomfortable for Lily, and perhaps at points Scheherazade as well. And then various other characters from their lives come and stay briefly at the castle, kind of illuminating various ways in which this triangle cannot possibly hold or remain stable. There is also the backward glance done by Keith in his 50s and onwards, where he's reflecting on that summer and what it's meant to him and how it's changed his life. But I will not give away the plot of the Coda out of consideration for people who may yet have Pregnant Widow to enjoy for the first time.
That's excellent. So yeah, we have Keith Nearing, little Keith. Very much, it seems, as most of Amos's young male characters, a depiction of Amos's self-image in some way. You have Scheherazade. Each of these characters signify a kind of idea. Again, in the way that Amos often does, he likes to attach his characters to universals. He describes Lily as the intelligentsia, Scheherazade as nobility, Keith Nearing as the proletariat, and is referred to as a comedy of manners. I mean, it quite clearly is in some way, but you seem to have read it with a great deal more interest in its multi-textual and multi-thematic dimensions.
I think it is very much hyphenate in its genre codification, and I think that's one of the things that I find really enjoyable about the novel. I know that others have criticised it, for instance, sort of saying that the latter half of the novel just doesn't work or should have been cut, but I think what actually makes it interesting is that it is keenly self-aware of all the genres that it engages with, comedy of manners being among them. I mean, you know, all of the kind of hopping in and out of the games room waiting for certain people, for instance, does feel quite a lot like a Fablio. But I mean, Amos was immensely erudite. This is him having fun. He is, you know, very much comfortable with the level of craft that it takes to sustain all these different genre affiliations and gestures. I mean, there are even excerpts of poetry quoted at various points in the novel, which would be unforgivable in a lesser novelist, but he just about gets away with it.
He often does just about get away with a lot, doesn't he? I mean, even throughout the novel, he's giving you the etymology of various words. Pregnant, he tells us, means before birth in the Latin root. Widow, to be empty, a Proto-Indo-European root. You know, he's always throwing in these little bits. And again, almost in a way, I think, as a kind of favour to the reader. He wants you to go away with a sort of light, sophisticated education.
I mean, it's almost like what is it the lecturer says to Charles Highway in that interview in the Rachel papers, which is you're terrible, but you know, if I don't get to you, then you're going to get even worse. I mean, it's almost like entering into a pact with Amos where like you see the terribleness in him and he recognises the terribleness in you, but you will come away with it having read something and probably with many more recommendations for other important texts.
Did you laugh a lot reading this novel?
Yes, actually, I did. I mean, there were parts of it that also made me want to cry. I mean, maybe I will read one of them later. But, I mean, it is also ecstatically funny. I mean, one of the things I love about him is that he does sometimes revel in the ugliness and the pettiness of human beings, but he still makes it light and funny. And all of those different, in some ways, contradictory emotions are kind of pulled into tension with one another.
Okay, so give us an example of that.
Well, the example that I'm thinking of is actually the one that almost brought me to tears, but it is also ecstatically funny. I would be delighted to read this one for you. Making love to a fragrant 20-year-old girl in summer in a castle in Italy while the candle wept its light. Action is transitory, a step, a blow, the motion of a muscle, this way or that. 'Tis done. And in the after vacancy, we wonder at ourselves like men betrayed. Suffering is permanent, obscure and dark, and shares the nature of infinity. Making love to a fragrant 20-year-old girl in summer in a castle in Italy. Christ, even in heaven they couldn't stand it. Even in heaven they couldn't stand it another second, and made war. Just under half of them, angels and archangels, virtues, powers, principalities, dominations, thrones, seraphim and cherubim, they couldn't stand it another second, even in heaven, strolling the empurpled pavements soft with smiling roses, lolling on ambrosial clouds and quaffing immortality and joy. Even in heaven they couldn't stand it another second, and rose up, gave battle and lost, were hurled over the crystal battlements and toppled down into chaos, there to raise the black palace of pandemonium, the place of all devils, in the deep of hell, Satan, the adversary, and Belial, the worthless, and Mammon, the covetous, and Moloch, the child-eater, and Beelzebub, whose name means Lord of the Flies.
So what to say about this first extract?
I think it captures so many things in one, in addition to all of the different literary references that he's making. So, for instance, I mean, he's really evoking that moment after sex where one realizes one's own mortality and then feels deeply sorrowful about it. But the kind of giddy joy of the moment, the fact that, Keith is never going to be young again, and he half knows it and half doesn't, because we can never fully know it until it's gone. And he's also just having a lot of fun with this massively overblown description of the war in heaven, which is also taking place as a metaphor for climax. So there's the filthy, the profound, and also just the very real nostalgia, all wrapped into one.
Very Charles Highway-like in so many ways. I mean, Keith Nearing spends most of this holiday in Italy reading the English classics. I think it's Gloria who comes to him about Pride and Prejudice when she's reading it and wants to know whether Elizabeth marries Darcy. And we know that this is, of course, the almost seminal exchange between... I shouldn't really say seminal exchange, should I? Between Amos and his mother, Elizabeth Jane Howard. So yeah, there are lots of little bits of Amos himself looking back at his past, the way Keith Nearing is, and taking little bits of it and cherishing them, but also kind of mourning them, mourning their formativeness.
That's a really interesting exchange of places, because it's easy to read Amos into Keith. It's much harder and more counterintuitive to read Amos into Gloria. But really, I'm not going to give a spoiler, but one of the things that Gloria does allows her to sort of play with narrative time, and that actually does link her to Amos the writer. So hearing you say that makes so much more sense. The kind of anxiety about a foregone conclusion, and then the kind of control over narrative that the other characters don't perhaps have over their own lives.
It's a novel very much about lost youth. And you mentioned earlier in the conversation the COVID pandemic. I've always and continue to feel quite sorry for any young person who, like Keith Nearing, is convinced that they are reaching the peak of their youth in those very key moments between the ages of 20 and 21, which of course may be exaggerated. But I think Keith's sense is that no, that is really when it peaks, and everything can be considered kind of, a departure from youth after that. What did it make you think about the theme of youth and mourning its loss?
I think he is very aware of the things that you can just about get away with. I'm just realised I've used that phrase again, but this time in relation to life rather than writing. When you are that age, that would perhaps be frowned upon a lot more when performed by someone much older. For instance, I mean, the extent to which some of Keith's behaviour towards Lily is ever excusable is a whole debate in and of itself. But what Keith does have going for him is that he is young and stupid and has read more books than he has lived. So it is slightly easier to cast a generous eye on that behaviour, whereas that behaviour in someone of the age of 31 or 41 is really pretty much inexcusable, because by that point you have seen enough things and experienced enough things that it would be sociopathic.
All the characters in The Pregnant Widow are riding the wave of the sexual revolution, obviously, as young people at the turn of the 70s. It's even used in here, this novel, the phrase pouncing off of the spirit of the times, which is something that occurs again in Inside Story. The thing about all of them, though, Keith, Scheherazade, Lily, all of them are victims of the sexual revolution. They're all struggling to get along with it, whether they are very beautiful and therefore preyed upon and objectified like Scheherazade, or someone like Keith Nearing who sees this movement as supposedly opening up great opportunities for the most kind of intense pleasure that there is known to man, and yet can't seem to capture it for himself. Or Lily, who feels that this movement's come along just at the time where she is both her youngest and supposedly most beautiful, but doesn't feel beautiful. All of them seemingly lose in some way, don't they, out of this deal?
Yes, they do all lose out quite a bit. I mean, my suspicion, especially because of something that happens with Lily later in the novel, is that Lily actually isn't at all bad looking. It's that she's in a terrible relationship with Keith, and also that the locals in this Italian hill town are only very interested in Scheherazade for two reasons, which I don't need to name. I mean, yes, Scheherazade has all of this extremely unpleasant kind of predatory behaviour launched at her with full force, and Keith is kind of convinced that now is his moment, because yes, it is a different kind of male vanity, that, this is it, this is happening, it's all happening, and if I don't get on it now, I will just completely miss out. And we see later that actually he has many more years in him, some very good years and some very bad years, but that real sense of urgency from the kind of epochal change. I'm just trying to think what the equivalent for my own generation would be. In some weird ways, it may actually be social media, like the people who really made a go of social media and were unafraid to kind of bare their souls on there. I think some of them actually probably really benefited from that, and some of them were also casualties of it. And I remember standing back and looking at it being like, I don't want to give my location and my inner thoughts and, you know, all of these really intimate details of my life in an unadulterated form. And maybe I lost out from that.
Just to build up online status, you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty steep step down, isn't it, from, you know, the sexual revolution with all of its pleasure, the pleasure of simply hitting 100,000 followers. But there we go. And of course, there are many other characters in The Pregnant Widow. We're obviously talking about the main three, and they are the main three: Keith, Scheherazade, Lily. But we are introduced to Adriano.
I have such a soft spot for Adriano because, okay, so I think is he 4'6", 4'4"?
I was going to say, one of the things you prepared listeners for is a conversation about short kings, and he's the real short king. Keith walks around thinking that he's the short-assing it about Italy. But then when he meets Adriano, who, for all of his 4'7"-ness, is incredibly athletic.
I mean, I love Adriano both because he's Amos reflecting on himself in some ways. Like, there is actually a shorter man, like it could be worse, which is a kind of refreshing change from some of the portrayals of short Keiths in earlier novels.
Yes.
And also because he has sort of somersaulted in from a completely different genre. I mean, he feels like something like almost a futurist creation, that he's been in all these terrible accidents. I mean, you know, the story of his life is something out of a great European novel from the first half of the 20th century. Whether it's truthful or not, we are not sure.
He has a sort of a Hemingway-esque appetite for danger, doesn't he? Which obviously offends Keith Nearing's sensibilities, as he's got his nose in a book. Here's a man actually going to war with heaven and the fine line between life and death.
I mean, just as, you know, the pitfalls and advantages of social media compared to the things you could have gained from the sexual revolution are a very poor comparison. I mean, the things that Keith wants for himself versus the things that Adriano of an earlier generation has already experienced is just laughable. I mean, you know, he is his own pint-sized action hero.
He's constantly getting injured, isn't he? He's always got a fresh scar, a missing toe.
I mean, also, I think he has that funny, almost indestructible quality that I really associate with kind of legendary, particularly men of the 20th century, where I'm not sure if we are all just more durable than we think we are, or if it was something to do with how much more people drank in those days, but he is Teflon in a way that, like, I wouldn't particularly expect my body or the body of someone, you know, of my generation, even in their 20s, to be. I mean, I get that he is a fictional creation, but, you know, I'm sure I could dig up some examples of these sort of the pint-sized fighter pilots who seem to have gone up in flames and then walked it off.
We've spoken probably about more characters already in this episode than we would have in previous episodes. But as a comedy of manners, there's a lot going on. How have maybe some of the characters from The Pregnant Widow influenced those of the Decadence, if at all?
That's a really fun question. So I think it starts with certain comedy of manners elements, particularly because Jan is having an affair with her old friend Nadia behind her aristocratic host Theo's back, and has partly agreed to come and cater this trip in this sort of crumbling manner in the countryside because she thinks she can sneak about with Nadia in the background under Theo's very drugged up nose. And then the other friends on the trip include Cara, who never met a movement she didn't want to involve herself in, her on and off again boyfriend, Luke, who never met a powder he didn't want to inhale, and then Ursi, Jan's long-suffering ex-lover, who's wondering why on earth she's agreed to go on this holiday with all of these really spoiled white people. So you can see the potential for conflict is right there, and they do start to really get into it, but also the nature of being in this isolated place and kind of, in some ways, very exposed to each other, in other ways concealed from each other by the architecture of this massive house, I think lends itself to that comedy of manners.
You write in your author's note for The Decadence, I grew up to love L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between, Aldous Huxley's Chrome Yellow, Toby Litt's Finding Myself, Martin Amis's Dead Babies, and Iris Murdoch's The Unicorn. Both The Pregnant Widow and a lot of Iris Murdoch's work play on this idea that you keep people captive in a specific place and you see what happens, which is always a fun thing, I imagine, for a novelist to do, to just say, look, these are the parameters, and now the enclosure allows for everything from the highest drama to the most hilarious comedy.
As in the note, I do really love Murdoch. I think although some of her novels do have quite violent endings, she's perhaps not as interested in nastiness and the limits of nastiness as Amis can be. And I would say that some of the most barbed conversations in the Decadence and some of the worst behaviour of my characters is probably more inspired by Amis than by Murdoch, simply because he's prepared to go there. And in rereading The Pregnant Widow this time, I thought, actually, I could have been even worse. I could have done more. I mean, for instance, I don't show any of them going to the bathroom. And, that's fine. I think some people will probably be grateful for that. But
Amos would have.
But Amos probably would have.
It's been said many times on this series that Amos can have quite a depressant effect on the reader, despite the fact that he's a great comic novelist. And you've just said there that you feel as though that's what you get in The Pregnant Widow too. Amos is exploring just how nasty people can be, how vindictive, how narcissistic, how shallow.
I mean, I think showing human life and the kind of vagaries of the human spirit in full technicolor does not necessarily have to be depressing. There will be depressing elements to it, but I don't actually leave the book feeling depressed by it, nor do I leave, for instance, like Greek tragedies feeling depressed by it. I feel kind of cleansed and purged by them because I have kind of gone through it fully emotionally with them.
Do you feel the way I do, in the same way you mentioned Greek tragedy, that all human behaviours echo in eternity? Keith's nastiness is just a nastiness that many, many Keiths and other men have exercised before him, and that it helps you to come to terms with the fact that we can't really reform ourselves as much as we'd like to think we can. But in that, there is maybe some comfort.
I think there is comfort in the fellow feeling, but I mean, like, the work is not yours to complete, but nor are you free to walk away from it. Like, we still, I think, probably have some obligation to try and better ourselves, knowing, of course, that we will fail.
It would only be bad faith not to.
But I mean, one example that I can think of actually from my own novel is the secondary character of Luke, who spends quite a lot of the novel pestering, particularly Theo, for ketamine. And in almost every scene, he's either being accused of stealing from people, actually it's the ghost a lot of the time, or, or he's kind of whining and nagging. And that's incredibly annoying behaviour, in person and in theory. But also what it's actually covering up is this real neediness, this longing to be around other people, this discomfort in his own skin. And also he's someone who has grown up very religious and then kind of become an atheist and is actually really not comfortable with that. So there's also this sort of spiritual longing to kind of be at peace with himself and to be part of something bigger, but it's sublimated into the urge for Ket.
I'd like to talk about dead babies in a moment, since we mentioned it just now. But what you said there about the ghost in the Decadence, there are ghosts in The Pregnant Widow too, aren't there? To the extent that this is looking back and remembering trauma.
I have something to say on the theme of ghosts and Gloria, but I'm going to try really hard not to give spoilers.
Let's try not to give spoilers, but let's talk a bit more about Gloria, because we haven't yet, and she's actually an incredibly important character in this book, isn't she?
Yes, I think in some ways she's actually really key to the book. And it was while leafing back through that I realized there were all these moments in the later sections where he's talking to his third wife, where he's actually talking about Gloria and the impact that she had on him. I think there's some line in there about pincers, possibly in relation to the sexual trauma. And it's only when thinking about Gloria that you actually realise how much she sent everything off course. And why I find her really fascinating is that she is this sort of femme fatale in, layers upon layers of disguise. And like every good femme fatale, she has a secret or several secrets. And that's kind of what gives her her power over the other characters. And it's also what gives her her sexual allure, I would argue. It's not just her physiognomy. It's also the fact that there's something about her that that she will not tell you. And I think I particularly find femme fatales so engaging because of the weird relationship that I have to them as a woman, because on the one hand, they're really irritating because it's a kind of expression of power and dominance to be like, I'm a femme fatale, there's things I won't tell you, I have all of this sexual power over others. And at another level, they're almost impossible to resist because that is their whole raison d'etre. And also the question of who they are to themselves. I mean, when Gloria's looking in the mirror and saying, I love me so, it's for someone else's benefit. How does she look at herself in the mirror when she's alone?
Have you read Inside Story? You have a copy here of Experience, but there's something about Gloria that reminded me of Phoebe Phelps.
Inside Story is actually one of the ones I want to get to, and it's through listening to my Martin Amis that I've realised I've got to get to it a bit faster.
Well, Anthony Quinn, whom I interviewed about Inside Story, just on the subject of women, he used a word that I've been trying to look up ever since. He said that Amis was melioros, very fond of women. Was Martin Amis melioros?
I think up to a point. There is an appreciation, for instance, in The Pregnant Widow, that Lily has her own intellectual life, that women can have often very scathing perspectives on the men and the male narrators and male protagonists in Amis's novels. What I'm less clear on is whether there are any ugly women in Amis who are afforded full humanity. I'm actually not sure that there are. Please step in to correct me. Because, for instance, like Hemingway often gets accused of being misogynist, but, for instance, Pilar is one of his greatest characters. And it's right there in the text. She is not attractive, and yet she is a fully rounded human being. But
by contrast, then, Amis, you feel, doesn't do this in any satisfactory way in any of his novels. If I'm going to disagree, I'd just like to be clear what your...
I'm laying it on the table in the hope that I will be corrected, because I really admire Amis. I like his writing. I like his writing about beautiful women who I think he does afford a lot of humanity and intellect to. So I'm hoping that the answer will be a contradiction.
Well, I don't disagree with the way that you limit your praise of his portrayals. I think that he does afford them humanity. He certainly affords them intellect. Sometimes that depth is the mystique that he imbues them with rather than depth of experience. But he sort of addresses it in The Pregnant Widow, where he refers to the objectification of women and how Keith is reflecting on this phrase and thinking, women don't appear to be objects at all to me. They seem to be teeming with life. But then he describes Scheherazade's thighs as like twin heavens.
Yes, and in fact, there is another female character in the novel, Amon's sister, Rua, and although it's probably more realist, it does still make me sad that we never hear from her, that they never really talk to her properly. I think at one point she's described as kind of like a monument, so again, she has this sort of bodily integrity, but because she's not sexually available to him at all, and I think they're very rude about the fact that she's a bigger woman, she doesn't really feature as a kind of character with an inner life, and I think that is it does make the novel feel a bit lacking in that regard.
There's another thing too. Gloria, in her early entrance into the novel, is referred to as a cock. She's referred to as a cock because Keith determines that she's actually really a boy. And I think she even says this of herself.
Yes, she actually does. And she says it in such a way that the first time I read that passage, I thought that she was coming out to him as intersex, and I had to reread it to understand that they were talking kind of colloquially about the fact that she's actually a kind of very sexually liberated and expressive woman.
Exactly. It's easy to be thrown by that moment, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And I mean, Lily kind of tries to be, in the words of the novel, a cock, and it doesn't really work for her. But I mean, again, it's the blazoning taken to such an extreme that, you know, like for instance, like in Done, you'll break down all the different parts of a woman and there will be kind of orbs or like My America and so on. And then the woman is just this like strange bricolage of things, both kind of real and elevated. And then, you know, post-sexual revolution, she's just one thing. She's a cock.
We've obviously mentioned Rita. I think you have another reading for us.
I do have another reading for you. Kenrick laughed reluctantly, then unreluctantly. He said, "Whiplash. She's sort of great, the dog. I'm too young to be doing all that queer stuff. Too young and too queer. What's it like, all that queer stuff? It's terrifying, really. Cool at the time. Rita's right, you know. I don't think I like it. Now the girls like it. I liked it better when they didn't, or pretended not to. What's the time? Can I start drinking yet? That kiss reminded me of something. There was kissing. And kissing was all? Yeah, I think. You know, I'm 90% certain I wasn't a naughty boy last night, and I'll tell you why." He came up on an elbow. See, for about a week I've been thinking, I'm going to make an announcement. I'm going to announce that I won't be fucking anyone ever again.
Rita is referred to as the dog because Keith is always giving these nasty nicknames to people and also nasty nicknames to a real dog that they find in Italy that he calls the Rat. But he refers to Rita as a dog because she doesn't have much of a waist and she doesn't have much of a chest. She's a northern lass, it seems, and she freely admits that she's got two backs and that when she wiggles her hips, she looks a little bit like a dog wagging its tail. Keith's the proletariat, but Rita is kind of the more out-and-out proud proletariat. She's completely unembarrassable, isn't she?
I mean, in some ways, you could read both Adriano and Rita as kind of phallic symbols jousting with each other. And, you know, Rita is still around at the end of the novel. Adriano is in rather poor shape, I believe. And, I mean, she's also... Is it Rita who says that when girls start to pay for things themselves, they hate you? I mean, she, you know, despite all of the horribleness of Kenrick and to some extent Keith, Rita does what she wants. She doesn't always necessarily want what she wants afterwards, but she does have this kind of self-directed dynamism that some of the other women in that novel, including Scheherazade, who, again, is an aristocrat, doesn't.
Yeah. On the subject of phallic symbols, there's a moment where Keith describes women as made up of pairs, he says. There's symmetry all the way down. By comparison, the male body is kind of interrupted by what he says is this kind of anomaly. It's a question mark that can sometimes become an exclamation mark and then goes back to being a question mark. Now, to me, that is vintage Amos right there.
That is vintage Amos. It also actually makes me think again of the comments about death, because he sees women as these sort of bifurcated collections of objects. And I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but he's talking about subatomic reality as being feminine and narrative as being feminine. And then his wife and daughters push back on him and say, well, it's the middle reality that we live in that's very masculinist. And he doesn't have a response to that. But yeah, he sees, you know, himself to a degree and men as being kind of very singular and unified. And I think it's that idea of the body becoming fragmented that creates all of this kind of horror and abjection, because it's just occurred to him that, you know, one day he will again have, you know, go back into the soil and be kind of in a multiplicity of things.
What Amos did so well, what Amos did probably better than any modern writer, is he was just able to perfectly express all the things that men get wrong. Keith is constantly coming up against his own limits in this book, isn't he? He's learning a lot. It's an educative journey. But it just so happens to be coming at the point in his life where he feels he should be able to execute, like all young men, everything that they've learned up to that point, just in time to be the youngest they're ever going to be. And he's realizing that actually reaching the peak of his youth is also learning the peak of his own stupidity.
I think that's beautifully put. I mean, it's the kind of, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. And, you know, you can't write with the kind of comic genius Amos does without putting it to some extent at a surface level. Like, this is the thought process of a man who does not know yet what he does not know and fears the things he knows he does not know. And, you know, for instance, the Richardson inspired adventure, put it that way, where he thinks he's being so subtle and is really not, is a kind of perfect example of him not having the full self-awareness that he might have yet. Actually, I've also just thought of something else, which is that the episode where he's thinking a lot about Dracula in response to Scheherazade, he's kind of borrowing both this sort of imagined aristocratic glamour of Dracula and also the wisdom of age, because his imaginary kind of priapic Dracula self knows exactly what to do in that moment, but real life Keith only thinks of it later.
Brings us on to Dead Babies. Sam Leith said that he turns all the dials up to 11 in that book. It's based in a place called the Appleseed Rectory, much closer, in fact, to the Decadence, which is based in a southwest mansion, isn't it? Let's talk about Dead Babies.
So Dead Babies is another great favourite. And it's interesting, actually, because as you point out, the two novels, Dead Babies and The Pregnant Widow, have a lot in common, and yet Dead Babies got so much more backlash than The Pregnant Widow, and that was partly to do with the fact that, you know, it was his second novel, he was the son of Kingsley Amis, but I also think that it's because he was closer to those characters in age. So it's implicitly a criticism of him and an assumption that he is like those characters. Whereas he's obviously very far away from the 70s characters in The Pregnant Widow. And then again, in the reviews, the parts that came in for the most criticism were Keith looking back. So once you kind of get far enough away from your subject matter, even if you are a very criticised and sometimes reviled author, then it sort of becomes more acceptable again to look at it forensically.
Your mother, Amanda Craig's latest novel, High and Low, has just recently been published. Since you mentioned the reception that Dead Babies got at the time, I think it's worth now going on to the subject of being a hereditary novelist. I'm assuming that you prefer hereditary novelist to Nepo novelist.
I think that the former appellation is a bit more pleasant, yes.
No shade embedded in it, certainly. The subject then of being a hereditary novelist is one that you've spoken about openly. I think a Guardian writer, interestingly called John Self, wrote an article about this subject. Is being a hereditary novelist, do you suspect, easier now than it might have been for Martin Amis?
I mean, I'm very grateful to him for being the first one, and I suppose perhaps also envious because it was one of his USPs early on, and then he obviously kind of established himself in ways that were irrelevant to Kingsley. But is it easier now? I mean, Google exists. If someone wanted to Google my novel in Waterstones and said, oh, well, you know, her mother's also a writer, I'm putting this back down, that would be a sort of peril that I don't think the Rachel Papers, for instance, would have faced. I mean, I think I just sort of have to take it on the chin, really, because yes, I am enormously lucky that I grew up in a house with a lot of books where writing was talked about very openly. But, you know, there are also drawbacks associated with it. But frankly, people don't want to hear about them, and I kind of don't blame them.
You described your mother as a helicopter parent. What do you make of the whole process of giving your work to your parent to read? And how has that been for you?
I mean, my mother hasn't been allowed to edit my work since I was about 15, because I think when you are confronted with the person who literally taught you to read, as my mother did with me, the power differentials are so skewed that you can't really take editorial feedback from them at that early stage. And I don't think it would be helpful because it would just create a kind of strange palimpsest of our work that nobody needs. Funnily enough, I actually read Experience by Martin Amis in my early 20s because I was trying to disentangle this knot before going to therapy. And it was really striking that I was expecting there was to be quite a lot in Experience about, you know, how do I become a writer when Kingsley's already a writer and he's not going to think necessarily that well of my work, etc., because Kingsley was very forthright. And actually, there's not a huge amount, as I recall, in Experience about this. And I remember being a little bit almost miffed at the time. I was like, this was supposed to be helpful. And then being like, but maybe the lesson here is just to get on with it and just be a bit more bloody-minded. I mean, with Parallel Hells, my mother literally wasn't allowed to read any of those stories until they were already published. And then she was very sweet and very generous about them. And then with the Decadence, I think very late on, I came to ask her about some things to do with gardening because she is much more competent in terms of all things to do with horticulture than I am. And I think that's probably the most healthy dynamic for both of us because it means that we both have our own kind of separate mental space to work and we'll come together and talk about other people's books or maybe technical issues in our writing. But it keeps us from pulling each other's hair out because we're also both incredibly opinionated and often have quite different opinions.
Sounds incredibly functional and mature.
Getting there.
So you read Experience hoping to find some answers to what to do about being a hereditary novelist and didn't find them. Did you find simply the story of their relationship fascinating in its own right?
Yes, I found it incredibly charming and you know, their letters and the kind of things they squabbled over and that detail about Kingsley eating lots of sweets, I remember.
Yeah, head like a basketball.
Exactly. And I think also it showed me how two very strong personalities with the same, let's say, calling can still coexist. So I think it was actually kind of both enjoyable and educational in that sense.
Do you agree with him when he says that there's nothing less interesting than what your mother or father does for a living? Did you have that feeling that it felt just normal to be a writer? And that's kind of what maybe gave you the sense that I could do this too, because it's not the Everest that somebody from outside that world might see it as?
I think it's a degree of normality, and I think it also massively de-romanticizes everything about the process. I mean, I think Amos was actually also particularly good on this with the information because, you know, he's been both the less successful novelist and the successful novelist, and then was able to inhabit both of those personalities really convincingly. And yeah, I think just a hard-won degree of realism about what writing most likely can and can't do for you is really necessary. And for, you know, while I am very lucky to have a novelist parent, a lot of writing for pretty much everyone is rejection and missing out on parties because you have a deadline and just having to do it anyway and kind of cursing yourself for continuing with it. And like, it's not necessarily very glamorous, it's not necessarily very fun, but I'm like, okay, this is what I signed up for and I just have to get on with it.
I think it's a very important thing to say, actually, and I think a lot of people will be appreciative that you've said it.
Yes, sadly it has. That painting of the death of Chatterton flows before my eyes. Okay, on a slightly less hyperbolic note, I mean, the things that are the most forward-facing are often the things that are also the most glamorous. And, you know, now we're in a more confessional age. People do try to demystify the process. For instance, the writer Molly Aitken is very good at kind of creating content around the realities of the writing life, and I really appreciate that. But it does feel kind of like breaking through a taboo because most of us are creatures of ego. We want people to see us when we're succeeding and not when we're kind of wailing and gnawing at things.
With The Pregnant Widow, where do you see it sitting in Martin Amis's journey as a writer?
I see it as very plugged into the canon of Amos works in a variety of different ways. So obviously there is the through line of the Keiths, so it's very connected to his early novels, is looking back at them. But because he's also really reached this like elite level of time management as a writer, I also see it as connected to other works like Time's Arrow, because he is playing all of these games with the way that memory can kind of pull you back and the kind of almost tennis-like motion between past and present. In addition to being related to his novelistic oeuvre, I think he actually also was very early in picking up on the way that the 70s would become relevant again. I mean, for instance, I'm reading this book at the moment, which is The Revolutionists by Jason Burke, which looks at kind of the history of things like hijacking and terror attacks in the 70s. And there's a little glimmer of that where he's talking about, I think it's the Baader-Meinhof gang saying that shooting is like fucking. And, you know, it just, this shadow crosses over Keith. And there are these sort of funny little glimmers in the novel, like Ammon and his sister Rua, but he doesn't fully go there because I think he's also learnt that maybe like it's better when he doesn't comment extensively on Islam. Actually, that's not true, because in the interviews he starts talking about how Islam would have saved his sister, but he saves it mostly for the interviews, except for one bit at the end, which we probably shouldn't go to because it's a massive spoiler.
We haven't talked about weapons of mass destruction. We haven't talked about nuclear threats, but obviously this looms as well as the sexual revolution in The Pregnant Widow. And Keith obviously reflects on what it means for people to love, to say that they love each other, to commit to anything so deep when, you know, as he says, the world could end at any moment, and the effect that that had on a generation. But we haven't mentioned Whittaker. He's another one of those characters like Rita who's sort of slightly on the sidelines. I wrote in my notes, like a Lord Henry Wotton. He's sort of one of those figures who's sanguine, observant, not particularly affected by what's going on around him, but a kind of good counsel at times for Keith.
Yes, he is very sanguine about things. I mean, he also just has the benefit of being older than them, so he can kind of see a lot of their hijinks coming. I also really like that he and Ammon are still kind of in each other's lives, like for quite a long time. And you get to see a kind of different flavour of that relationship, because there's this strange speech that Whittaker gives about kind of monogamy and gay men, which feels like someone else's speech from a pub that Amos has sort of picked up and inserted, and it is very stereotypical, but it also gives Whittaker's attitude to the sexual revolution a slightly different angle, because like for a lot of queer people, the sexual revolution is very relevant to us, but we're also not necessarily coming at it in the same way that men and women who are sexually interested in each other have to experience the kind of historical ramifications of that time.
And he also talks, Amos, in this novel about the age wars. I've just seen here a quote, "The generation less and less affectionately known as the baby boomers. We will be hated. The silver tsunami." These generational wars, these age wars have kind of come to a head, haven't they, in recent years?
Yes, they absolutely have. I mean, he sees it cresting the horizon and kind of knows that it is inevitable. But reading this, I also really don't envy them in a lot of ways. I mean, having to renegotiate the sort of social landscape for the first time, kind of, navigating without a map in a lot of ways, sounds honestly quite terrifying.
Shall we have one last reading?
6 months ago, she was a lollipop girl, helping school kids cross the road and ferrying dinners around in a van. I wouldn't even swear in front of her. But she's different. She's changed. You should hear her now. Sex, sex, sex. There's so much more woman in her now. He remembered Lily's description of her, Lily's first time with the French student in Toulon, and her walking on the beach the next morning and thinking, God, I'm a woman, awakened to womanhood. This is what psychologists called an animal birthday. An animal birthday is when your body happens to you. It wasn't like that for boys the first time. The first time was just something you got out of the way. A feeling of helplessness went through him, and he reached for Lily's hand. Oh yeah, he said, when Gloria Beautyman comes, you've got to pretend not to know about her day of shame. Violet's a bit like that when she drinks, isn't she? Yeah, but she's a bit like that when she doesn't drink too. Remember, we're not to traduce Gloria. You know what that means, Lily. Traduce? Go on then. From Latin traducere, lead in front of others exposed to ridicule. Traducement was what happened to tragic heroes. Get your laughing done with. Get your staring done with. So we won't traduce Gloria.
Leon Craig, thank you very much for joining me on this episode of My Martin Amis. It has been a hell of a lot of fun. Really enjoyed this one.
I really enjoyed this one too. Thank you so much for having me.